This is not just the story of a man who moved to another land. It is the story of a voice that interrupts comfort. It is the story of leaving without a map. It is the story of being pulled out of what you can measure and led into what you can only trust. It is the story of a call that sounds like loss and a promise that becomes destiny. His name was Abram, and his story begins before the road. It begins with a city that felt secure. It begins with a routine that felt permanent. It begins with a home that looked like stability, but could not heal the quiet ache inside it. Let us go back in time, before the altars in the dust, before the long nights under strange stars, before the covenant, before the name change, before the nations. It was an ordinary morning in Ur. The sun warmed the brick streets that still held yesterday's heat. Smoke rose from ovens as bread cracked and released its scent into the air. Merchants lifted wooden shutters and rehearsed the same bargains they had repeated for years. Guards passed in measured steps beside walls that promised protection. Everything seemed in order. The appearance of safety, the appearance of control. But behind the walls, Abram's heart was restless, because comfort can be loud, but it cannot answer the questions that whisper at night. Abram had built a life that made sense to everyone else. He had family, he had reputation, he had plans. And yet, the more predictable life became, the more his soul felt like it was shrinking. Sarai moved through the home with quiet strength. She carried herself with dignity, but her eyes carried a private grief. The kind of grief that does not announce itself. The kind of grief that only shows when she watches other mothers hold children. Abram noticed. He did not know how to fix it. And that is where many people begin building towers. Not out of pride first, out of fear. Fear that life will never change. Fear that the story will end exactly where it started. Fear that the best days are already behind you. And then the voice came, not as a suggestion, not as a gentle idea, but as a command that cut through everything familiar. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go. Go from your country. Go from your people. Go from your father's household. Go to the land I will show you." The sentence was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, because it did not explain where. It did not guarantee how. It did not promise ease. It only demanded trust. Abram stood still, because leaving is easy in the imagination. Leaving is brutal in the body. Leaving means you release what you can name for what you cannot yet see. Abram looked around his home as if seeing it for the last time. The walls were not evil. That is what makes obedience hard. God rarely calls people out of obvious darkness. He often calls people out of comfortable captivity. Abram tried to speak, but he did not have a speech. He had a decision, and the decision felt like tearing something inside his chest. Because the first sacrifice in Abraham's story is not an animal on an altar. It is the illusion of control. The next morning, Abram began to prepare, not with celebration, with trembling. He gathered what a household could carry: tents, jars, tools, animals, servants, and the faces of people whose future now depended on his obedience. Sarai watched him from the doorway. She did not argue. She did not demand a full explanation. But her eyes asked the question her mouth did not dare to ask. Are we really leaving everything behind? Abram could not promise her safety. He could only offer her honesty. He told her there was a voice, and the voice was stronger than his fear. He told her the call did not come with a map. It came with a promise. God said, I will make you into a great nation. God said, I will bless you. God said, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. God said, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Those words sounded beautiful, but they also sounded impossible. Because Abram had no nation. Abram had no land. Abram had no child. Abram had only a voice. And that is the definition of faith. Faith is not trusting what you can prove. Faith is obeying what you cannot yet explain. They stepped onto the road, and the first steps felt heavier than the bags they carried. Because leaving everything behind is not only leaving places, it is leaving identities. It is leaving the version of you that knows how to be admired. It is leaving the version of you that can predict tomorrow. It is leaving the comfort of being understood by everyone around you. The road out of Ur did not announce destiny. It looked like dust and distance. But heaven was watching that dust. Because the God who calls does not need your strength first. He needs your yes. And Abram's yes was not loud. It was simple. One step, then another, then another. And behind him, Ur became smaller. And ahead of him, the unknown became larger. And in the space between the known and the unknown, Abram learned the first secret of calling. When God says go, He is not trying to take your life away. He is trying to give it back to you. The land did not welcome Abram with open arms. It did not look like a blank page waiting for his destiny. It was already occupied. It already had cities, borders, and altars that did not bear the name of the Lord. And that is the first shock of calling. God may promise you a place, but He does not promise you an empty battlefield. Abram walked into Canaan and realized something immediately. The promise was real. But so was resistance. He traveled through the land, step by step, as if the ground itself was testing him. And then the Lord appeared to him. And the Lord said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Those words were pure promise. But Abram had no offspring. So the promise landed in him like both comfort and ache, because it sounded like hope, and it sounded like delay. Abram did not argue. He did not demand a schedule. He did what a called man does when he cannot control outcome. He built an altar. An altar is what you build when you cannot build a city. An altar is what you build when you are learning to worship in uncertainty. An altar is proof that you are no longer living by sight alone. Abram moved again, because calling rarely lets you settle too soon. He pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai, and he built another altar there, and he called on the name of the Lord. That became his rhythm. Tent, altar, road, tent, altar, road. Because faith is not a monument. Faith is a movement. And then Abram continued toward the Negev, toward the dry places, toward the places where there is no hiding your hunger, toward the landscapes that expose what you truly trust. And right there, in the place where he expected the promise to begin blooming, famine arrived. Not a small inconvenience, a real threat, a slow disaster, a test that asked one brutal question. Will you still trust when your environment contradicts your calling? Abram looked at his people. He looked at the animals. He looked at Sarai. He looked at the empty horizons. And fear began to whisper. Because famine does not just threaten your stomach. It threatens your faith. And the road that began with go was about to lead Abram into his first major collapse of confidence. Abram did not fall because he stopped believing in God's existence. He fell because he stopped believing God could be trusted in scarcity. So he turned toward Egypt, toward the place that looked like provision, toward the place that looked like control. And the closer Abram got to power, the more his old survival instincts woke up. Because leaving Ur does not automatically remove Ur from your heart. Sometimes your feet obey faster than your fears heal. Abram looked at Sarai and saw danger. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because beauty in the hands of powerful men can become a weapon. So Abram began to plan. He began to manage appearances. He began to craft a strategy that felt wise, but was rooted in fear. This is what fear does. It turns people into architects of self-protection. It makes you measure risk like an engineer. It makes you calculate outcomes like you can control human hearts. And for a moment, that strategy might even work. That is the most dangerous part. Because towers of control often work for a while. They can bring safety. They can bring influence. They can bring relief. But they always cost more than you think. They ask for compromise. They ask for silence. They ask for trust to be replaced with performance. And in Egypt, Abram learned a painful lesson. A called man can still be afraid. A blessed man can still panic. A man with a promise can still grab at control when pressure rises. But here is the mercy hidden inside the story. God does not abandon Abram when Abram becomes unreliable. God intervenes. God protects. God keeps the promise alive even when the carrier of the promise trembles. Because the covenant was never built on Abram's perfection. It was built on God's faithfulness. So Abram leaves Egypt changed, not proud, humbled. Because nothing exposes you like fear does. Fear shows you what you really worship. And Abram is now forced to face the truth. The promised land is not only a place on a map, it is a place in the heart where control dies and trust is born. And Abram is not done dying yet, because the next test will not come from famine. It will come from prosperity. It will come from success that creates conflict. It will come from family. It will come from the tension between two households walking under one promise. And that is where the story turns again. It turns toward Lot. It turns toward separation. It turns toward another kind of leaving behind. Abram came back from Egypt with more resources. But prosperity has its own test. Because when you have more, you also have more to fight over. The flocks grew. The tents multiplied. The servants argued over wells and pasture. And tension began to rise between Abram's people and Lot's people. It was not dramatic at first. It was small irritations. It was whispered complaints. It was eyes that stopped meeting. It was the slow birth of division. And Abram saw the danger. Not only the danger of losing land, the danger of losing peace. Because sometimes the enemy does not attack from outside. Sometimes it grows inside your own camp. So Abram did something that reveals the kind of man he is becoming. He refused to build his future on strife. He refused to cling to power like Saul. He refused to protect himself by crushing someone weaker. He looked at Lot, his own family, his own blood, and he offered him a choice. Choose the land you want. If you go left, I will go right. If you go right, I will go left. That moment looks simple, but it is costly, because Abram was the older. Abram was the one with the promise. Abram could have demanded the best land. But faith makes you generous, and fear makes you greedy. Lot lifted his eyes, and he saw what looked like advantage. He saw the Jordan Valley, well-watered and green. He saw fields that looked like safety. He saw cities that looked like opportunity. And Lot chose what looked like the better deal. Lot chose with his eyes. Abram was left with what looked like less. And this is where calling becomes painfully personal. You can obey God and still feel like you lost. You can do the right thing and still watch someone else take the greener valley. You can surrender and still feel like you are being punished for it. Lot departed, and the dust of his leaving hung in the air like a question. Did Abram just lose his future? Did Abram just lose his security? Did Abram just lose the one person who made the road feel familiar? Because Lot was not just a traveling companion. Lot was a piece of Abram's old world, and now that piece was gone. And notice the timing. It is after Lot leaves, after Abram is reduced again, after the support is removed, that God speaks. Because God often removes what you lean on, so you can finally feel what is holding you. The Lord said to Abram, "Look around from where you are. Look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever." And God adds something even bigger. "I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted." Then God gives Abram a command that feels like the opposite of settling. "Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram moved his tent, and he went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord, because Abram is learning a pattern. Loss does not mean abandonment. Reduction does not mean rejection. Sometimes God subtracts, so faith can finally breathe. And Abram's camp, smaller than before, becomes the place where God's promise sounds louder. But there is still a wound that refuses to close, the wound of waiting, because dust and land still do not answer the question Sarai carries in her silence. Where is the child? Where is the heir? Where is the proof? And that ache will drive Abram into the next scene. A scene where faith stops pretending it is strong. A scene where Abram speaks his doubt out loud. And God answers, not with the schedule, but with the sky. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, and God begins with what Abram needs most. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram is no longer pretending. He has walked too far to fake faith. He has left too much to lie to God. So Abram speaks the sentence that many believers are afraid to say. "What can you give me, since I remain childless?" Abram's question is not rebellion. It is exhaustion. It is the sound of a man standing in the gap between promise and proof. And God answers him. God tells him the servant will not be his heir. God promises him a son from his own flesh and blood. And then God does something cinematic. He does not just talk. He moves Abram. He takes him outside the tent, outside the calculations, outside the claustrophobic walls of waiting. And God says, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he says, "So shall your offspring be." The promise is not delivered as information. It is delivered as perspective, because God knows something about the human heart. When you stare at your lack long enough, your lack becomes your God. So God forces Abram to lift his eyes. He forces Abram to look at something too large to control. He forces Abram to face the truth. If the promise happens, it will not happen because you engineered it. It will happen because I am faithful. Abram stands under the stars, and something breaks open inside him. Not the sky, his grip. And Scripture says, Abram believed the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteousness. That is one of the quiet miracles of the Bible. Abram does not present perfection. He presents trust. He does not offer performance. He offers belief, and God counts it. God receives it. But here is what makes the story so human. Believing under stars does not erase years of waiting. A moment of faith does not instantly silence every fear. Abram can lift his eyes to heaven at night and still wake up the next morning with questions in his mouth. Because waiting is not just time. Waiting is pressure. Waiting is uncertainty. Waiting is the slow temptation to manufacture what God promised to give. And that is where the next part of Abraham's story moves. It moves from believing to enduring. It moves from a promise in the sky to a test in the body. It moves into the household. It moves into Sarai's pain. It moves into a decision that will feel like a shortcut. A decision that will create a new wound. A decision that proves this truth. Even after you believe, the heart still has to learn to wait. Waiting does not only test patience, waiting tests worship. Because when God is silent, the heart starts looking for something else to hold. Years passed. The tent stakes were moved again and again. The altars multiplied. The prayers repeated. And still, Sarai had no child. Every month was another reminder. Every cradle in another tent was another wound. And Sarai did what many wounded hearts do. She tried to solve pain with strategy. She tried to cure longing with a plan. She tried to manufacture what God had promised to give. Scripture says Sarai had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." That line is more revealing than it looks, because it is the language of Babel in the mouth of a hurting woman. Perhaps I can build. Perhaps I can fix. Perhaps I can force the future to arrive. Abram agreed to what Sarai said, and the plan worked. Hagar conceived. And for a moment, it looked like progress. But human-made solutions always come with hidden costs. Because you can't cheat the process of trust without wounding relationships. As soon as Hagar knew she was pregnant, contempt entered the house. Sarai felt humiliated. Hagar felt powerful. Abram felt trapped between two pains. And the household that was supposed to carry promise became a battlefield of emotion. This is what happens when you stop waiting on God and start using people. It doesn't just create results. It creates fractures. Sarai turned to Abram in anger. "This is all your fault," she said. And Abram, who once left Ur by faith, now stood in a tent filled with resentment and regret. Because waiting doesn't only tempt you to sin, it tempts you to redefine what strength means. The world calls it strength when you take control. Heaven calls it bondage when you cannot release control. And somewhere in that conflict, Abram hears the echo of the first command again. Go, leave, step away from what you can manufacture. Return to what you can only receive. Because the deepest danger in Abraham's story is not famine. It is not foreign kings. It is not desert roads. The deepest danger is this, that the promise becomes an idol. And when the promise becomes an idol, you will sacrifice people to get it. But God is not only the one who promises, God is the one who purifies. God will not let Abraham carry covenant with dirty hands forever. Because covenant is not just about outcome, it is about becoming. And the story is moving toward the moment where God asks Abraham to place even the promised son on the altar. Because God does not compete with idols gently. He destroys them with mercy. And that mercy will take Abraham to a mountain. A mountain where the word "go" will return one more time. A mountain where Abraham will discover what faith truly means. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he called his name, Abraham. And Abraham answered with the strongest spiritual sentence a human can speak, "Here I am." Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Notice the pattern. God still does not give the full map. He gives the next step. Early the next morning, Abraham got up. He loaded his donkey. He took 2 servants. He took Isaac. He cut wood. And he walked. 3 days of walking with a command that could crush a man's mind. 3 days where Abraham could have turned back quietly and called it wisdom. 3 days where fear could have rewritten obedience into 1,000 excuses. But Abraham kept moving, because the call was never only about geography, it was always about surrender. Isaac walked beside him, carrying the wood, and Isaac asked the question that pierces every parent, "Where is the lamb?" And Abraham answered with a sentence that reveals what covenant has done to him. God will provide. On the mountain, Abraham built the altar. He arranged the wood. He bound his son. He lifted the knife. And at the edge of the unbearable, God stopped him. And Abraham looked up. And there in a thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. He took the ram and sacrificed it instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." That is the climax of Abraham's life. Not because he proved he was strong, but because he proved God was faithful. Abraham did not save himself by building up. He was saved by laying down. Now the story becomes a mirror, because the real question is not whether Abraham was called. The real question is what God is asking you to leave. What Ur are you clinging to because it feels safe? What Haran have you settled in because partial obedience is comfortable? What Isaac are you gripping so tightly that it has become your proof that you matter? Because you cannot receive a promise while you are gripping your tower with both hands. You cannot follow a voice while you are worshiping control. So if today you hear that voice knocking on the door of your comfort, do not run away. Just answer the way Abraham answered. "Here I am. Here I am even if I feel scattered. Here I am even if I do not see the full plan. Here I am because your voice is greater than my fear." And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone stuck between a promise and a delay, share this story with them. Subscribe for more cinematic Bible stories that reveal the light behind the shadows. Because grace does not begin with a building. Grace begins with a call.